Hey guys, what's up? It's Cole. Yoshi-P has directly addressed in an IGN Brazil interview the 2 minutes meta as well as the homogenization of jobs. Two of the most hot topics, to say the least, of this expansion. So I'm going to go over his answer and I'm going to give you my honest thoughts on this, which is going to admittedly involve me admitting some things that I've been a little bit scared to say, but it's kind of how I honestly have felt and why I haven't really tackled my way into the debate yet. So IGN Brazil asked about the 2 minute meta and the homogenization of jobs, to which Yoshi-P said, "That's a difficult question. We have skill rotations varying between 60 and 120 seconds for the most intense phases, and that's how it works currently. But the reason that it's like this today is that we've received in the past feedback from all over the world saying that the timing of fights were difficult, it was difficult to align skills between the classes, we were asked to unify everything, and precisely because we received these requests to homogenize this, we homogenized it. In fact, in past expansions like Heavensward and Stormblood, the design of fights and classes were very different from how it is today. Just look at how classes that have completely changed from their original versions like Summoner, Astrologian, Bard, and Machinist. Furthermore, the design of the bosses in the arenas in which the fights take place were different, which created different situations and functions between melee and ranged classes." Is he talking about the size of the hitbox? They're huge now. There are those who say that having the game less quote-unquote on track is more fun, and Yoshi-P is not against this idea, but there is a balance that needs to be discussed. Although hardcore players make up the majority of those who complain about FF14's combat and has been homogenized over years, there is a significant portion of players who we can consider as intermediates who may not dedicate themselves to the more difficult encounters as diligently, but who do want to challenge themselves to overcome the game's most difficult fights and engage more frequently with the combat system than others who really stick to the more combat options offered by the MMO. Yoshi-P then continues saying, "We're okay with making things a little crazy and having different timings between all the classes, but again, we made these changes because we got feedback that it was too difficult before. We understand that there are two types of players, so going forward, regardless of whether we change this or not, the community needs to reach a consensus. What is better? Before changing something, we need to get feedback from everyone," concludes Yoshi-P, reiterating that feedback through official means is taken into account by the developer. So that is Yoshi-P's answer, and I have said it many times that the developers really are listening to the community, and as someone who has played a lot of games, I know everyone's just like, "Bitch, you sound like you're freaking like 20. I am young, okay, I get it. But you know what, in all my time playing games during my life, which I know is just a drop in the ocean, I have never felt as listened to by developers as here. And this is why I say, and I say it probably every 5 videos at least, the Final Fantasy XIV developers are a blessing, and that's one of the reasons why I really do enjoy making content, because I can tell you, the pocket change I make sure ain't it. But getting into the actual meat of the argument, what Yoshi-P said here is correct. The player base has consistently complained before ENDWALKER about alignment of buff skills. They were like, because we've had this many times before where we say have a 90-second cooldown skill, and then it's just like, okay, do I want to use a 90-second cooldown skill on my own, or do I want to hold it off, say 30 seconds later to align with the 2-minute window, or rather the next 60-second window? Why I'm saying next 60-second window is because just the legacy of the raid buff window was the ninja's ability called Trick Attack, which has likewise been reworked. It's now personal buff, but it used to be a group buff, and so everyone would funnel absolutely every big ability that they could into this window. And I'm going to continue with the ninja example. Every 60 seconds, and this remains today, this is still in today, and so every 60 seconds, likewise, 60 plus 60 is 120, that's 2 minutes, and so that aligns with the raid buff window again that we currently have today. Ninja is going to want to dump all of their big ninjutsu into that every 60 seconds, and that retains itself today. You're going to want to make sure that you have Hyosho Ranryu and that you have Raiton in there, and so every minute you're getting 2 Raiton off of your basic ninjutsu and then Kasatsu into Hyosho Ranryu, and that's going to be like your big burst. And then likewise you're going to get Tenchi Jin, and such as on the opener you're going to go Fuma Shuriken into Raiton into Suiton into Muisui, which is going to allow you to build up your gauge, which you're gonna spend there. I know that people not playing ninja are probably like, what the fudge? Basically, it means that we want to stuff everything into these raid buff windows, which used to be on a 60-second timer. Such as machinist, you'd want to time it with all of your abilities, where you'd have like Bob go and do something during that, and ideally is what you should have tried. Like, you never really wanted to go and cap to 100 on your gauge, for instance. But we're getting way too thick into the weeds, so I'm going to try and back us out. My point of saying all this is, we used to have a big problem where players really didn't feel that they could personally align what their job brought with the raid buff window that well, or that they were already struggling to get everything in there, such as it's just like, it's not intuitive to a lot of newer players. And I speak only because I have talked to so many newer players, like as someone who has, I think, over 7 million views on YouTube. Let me just double check that. Actually, I have 8.1 million views. My sub count actually sucks for how much viewership I get, but as someone with 8.1 million viewers, I can say I have had so many people come to me and be like, why don't you cap the machinist gauge at 100? And it's like, because you want to align summoning Bob to do something that's Overwatch reference during the raid buff window, because Bob's gonna do much more something during that window because of all the buffs. Actually, maybe I should say this because I know I might have genuinely new players not understand why. So you have chain strategy. That's a scholar buff that makes that target have an increased chance for the entire party when they're hitting that target to critically strike. That means if you use your heavy hitting things during that and you crit, that's going to be better. Or Red Mage brings Embolden, which is going to also amplify everyone's damage by whatever percent. I think it's 10% flat. It used to like scale down, but I'm not 100% sure these days. And then Bard brings a host of different buffs. When you have all these buffs stacked up, you have a massive spike of damage, and so all your heaviest hitting abilities really do a lot. And so that's why this is important. And so if your abilities, your heaviest hitting abilities aren't in this window, you're kind of really tossing a whole lot of your contribution into the garbage. And so, yes, people have definitely asked for this. Now, my question is, why have we gone from a 1-minute window to a 2-minute window? Is it just easier to navigate through for people to understand, where it's like you have that huge pivotal moment, say during a course of an 8-minute fight, like 4 times? Maybe, because we always did have the raid buff window. We have always had this concept, but it was at 60-second intervals. And I don't even think that's a debatable point. That is just what we were always saying for the longest time. So while people are kind of shitting on the 2-minute meta window, it's like it has always been a 60-second line up your shit, or what are you doing? You're throwing. Now I'm going to talk about homogenization, because I am probably one of the biggest opponents to homogenization, but I'm also someone who definitely sees the value of it. So why do I see the value of it? And this makes me not happy to say, but because it's easier to balance. Final Fantasy XIV in its current state today, who is going to argue that it has ever been a better balanced state than it is now? Amongst all the roles. Obviously, yes, Red Mage could use a little bit of love, but amongst all the roles, who can say that it isn't in the best state that it has been in? I think it would be very, very hard to point at it. I have been through Heaven's Ward, where there was literally a free company on Gilgamesh named Delete Monk, because it was so far behind. I have seen white mages not be taken in favor of Astro. I have seen Astros not be taken in favor of white mage. I have seen Warrior just be the de facto tank, and then all the others just be considered shit. Or Paladin, who remembers that it used to have flash, literally non-damaging skill that blinded enemies as its AoE, like aggro tool. I remember all this. The game is factually in its best balanced state. And then I think immediately to P8S and its DPS check, which, I mean, a lot of people, you know what, you can call it mid-core or hardcore, whatever. P8S is a form of content that I do believe is accessible to everyone. I think that fight, however, was one of the more challenging ones, because I tried to do it in Party Finder a bit, and I honestly lost my patience with everyone who is obsessed with greeting GCDs during snakes, even though everyone was massively overgeared. But P8S, during its launch, and it was nerfed, but it still was a little tricky in Party Finder with some groups, it had such a strong DPS check that people were picking apart logs. And we're talking, again, in this expansion, which is probably the most balanced the game has ever been, picking apart the logs, trying to, like, discern the tiniest little, like, DPS loss. And in fact, I would say that, utility has also kind of been homogenized, because it's like, okay, Bard brings this, Dancer brings that, and I was one of the people that said, hey, Machinist really could use some utility. And oh my god, there were some streamers, holy shit, like, you'd think that I literally, like, insulted their mother with how angry they were about that. They were like, you mother, and I'm like, girl, that's a lot of energy. But I stand by what I said, is Machinist needed some utility. And they got utility, and I think that that really balanced out even the range Visceral, because it's like, well, you don't want the Machinist to deal so much more damage than Bard and Dancer that both of those feel like garbage, so it's just like, give them some kind of utility, and we got the wrench back, which I think is a huge win. And I think that it is a good thing for all Machinist players, because frankly, having that tool is a huge thing during Raid, especially during Prog. I know in a lot of, like, easier forms of content, it's like, okay, what's the big deal about a mitigation? I can say that as someone who's done a bazillion Savage fights and has done a lot of ultis now, a lot of ultis in PF, you know what I liked as a tank, as the off tank, was a Paladin. Even though I was main tanking as a warrior in Uwu, I liked a Paladin. Do you know why I liked a Paladin? I liked a Paladin because a Paladin had not only Divine Veil, which was an amazing barrier, but they also had Passage of Arms, aka Cringe Wings, is what a lot of Paladin players I played with call them. They call them Cringe Wings because they don't want to do it. It's just like they want to weave it. But during Primal Roulette, at the very ass end of this, like, 15, 16, whatever minute fight, there is so much damage going out, and your healers, the mitigation check is real there. And so having a Paladin bring two different forms of mitigation, I loved that. I really loved that. It was so important. And so when I see Machinists have that, guys, I'm not embellishing. It is so useful. We're gonna back out of this rabbit hole, because trust me, I could shit out example after example after example, because I've been playing this game for a fucking decade. But, which is so long. I was so young when I started. Now I feel old. But, how to say it? This homogenization of even utility. It's been something that we kind of asked for, because it's like, okay, we want all the damage to be balanced, because if someone has so much more damage that it allows you to out DPS something, you're not going to take something with the lower DPS no matter what utility it brings. Case in point, a lot of groups didn't want to take Red Mage when the DPS check got real. Fact. This is not really a debatable point, because I was interacting with the people on a day-to-day basis. I was interacting and know a lot of World's First Raiders. They felt the same. They were like, you know what, Red Mage can revive all you want, but it's just like, you know what, between the lower damage and then the fact that every single mechanic's a body check, Red Mage kinda sucks. I'm so worried, because I know someone's gonna react to this and be like, that's not what we said. Well, fuck. You know what? Pull up most World First Raiders and ask them if they really think that that wasn't true for P8S. My point, and I'm gonna cap this at this, is we did kind of ask for this, because we want a game that is perfectly balanced, while we also want a game that has all of the jobs have their really big do I want to say it? Moment of glory in the raid buff window. I know that's not a moment of glory. Come on, I had to say it. You know what? Everyone's fucking saying that word. Let me say moment of glory. Fuck. Moment of glory. Raid buff window. I had to say it. But that's kind of like the biggest moment of glory, is like when everyone bursts like that. You know that that's true. But, we wanted everyone to line in the raid buff window. Everyone to have almost the same damage. Everyone to bring the same kind of utility. At some point there has to be some level of homogenization, because otherwise things do get really, really weird. Now, what I'm gonna say really does kind of bite my ass is that all healers have been really homogenized. Like, between Sage and Scholar, most of their kit's the same. Between White Mage and Astro, people are going to be mad at me. Most of their kit is the same, even though I'd say that they are probably way further apart than Sage and Scholar. Like, an Astro is going to be weaving in all these OGCDs, a White Mage is going to use Lilies on the GCD. Like, I can pick apart all these things because I've played all of them into the dirt and back. But there is definitely a lot of homogenization amongst healers, and I think with tanks there is a lot too. But I do know that a Dark Knight is going to play radically different than a Warrior. Like, I mean, yes, okay, you do spam the quote-unquote Fel Cleave equivalent with Dark Knight. But you know what, you also have all these OGCDs, you're also playing with the, like, Dark Knight barrier and cracking that to get the Dark Mind, Dark Arts charge that you're gonna then use on whatever it is called. So, even though there is a lot of homogenization, because it's just like there's one-to-one abilities, like they literally use same Rampart, but Shadow Wall is basically the exact same thing as Vengeance. They all have that little short cooldown other than Dark Knight that does deviate. Like, at some point, you have to admit that, yeah, they are pretty homogenized, and that if you can play one, you can probably pick up the other pretty easily. And here's where I'm gonna kind of have a casual player opinion, because my boyfriend is the definition of a casual player. He's a doctor, and he works all fucking day long. He works weekends. And so when he comes into 14, he wants to chill. He wants to just enjoy it. He wants to dive and dabble a little bit in Savage, even though we haven't really done that. That's fine. Bitches pull up my FF logs and be like, he didn't do the raid. Fuck off. So I'm doing ultis and PF. Fuck off. But my point is, he wants to come home and he wants to play something, and if he wants to play, say, tanks, it's nice because, hey, okay, they all follow the same structure, and so he can play a different tank if he's saying getting bored of Warrior, which Warrior in casual content is, a little bit more on the boring side, we have to all admit. So it's like, oh, okay, I could play Dark Knight. So I mean, taking into consideration what a lot of those players, the more casual players, think, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Or like, say someone plays a ton of like Sage or Scholar, they can then get some shakeup in the gameplay by doing the other barrier healer. And if, I think especially for barrier healers, it is really tricky. It is really tricky for me to think about, like, balancing that. Because if we think about how important it is as a barrier healer, maybe this should be its own fucking video, because no one would watch a video that's over 15 minutes long. Oh, well, whatever, I'll do it. I'm just kind of vibing anyhow. Barrier healers, they all have fundamentals that they need. They need to provide a certain amount of mitigation at certain points to meet basic checkpoints. Otherwise, you won't pass that checkpoint. And so, yes, Caracol for Sage is a Sacred Soil equivalent. Like, things like that, there is a baseline functionality, especially for barrier healers, above all other classes other than tanks that they need to have. Otherwise, they just can't function in that row. And so I'd say that they're probably the most homogenized of them all, Sage and Scholar. I really do believe that, unfortunately. But I see it almost out of necessity, because it's like, okay, let's say that Scholar had a billion different types of mitigations on top of what it had, like way above what Sage had, and say Sage had more pure healing. Well, depending on the fight, there's a good chance that you would see Sage be much more preferred in casual content, because that's where basic pure healing goes a long way further, and then you'd see Scholar picked a lot more in hard content, because that's where you see mitigation really go a lot further. But now we are getting way into the weeds, so I'm gonna cut it there. But kind of, Final Fantasy XIV is in the state where the player base demands things to be so finely tuned and balanced to one another that we're very sensitive to if something is further behind, because it's like, even right now, even though Red Mage is like so close to like the damage of a summoner, people are like, okay, but Red Mage has less mobility than a Black Mage, because a Black Mage can plan it out. Like, a lot of people don't understand that. Like, a Black Mage, when they plan out a fight, have a lot more mobility than Red Mage on the fly. Or even when a Red Mage plans it out, it's like, oh, I'll save it. I get too deep in the weeds. But we're still sensitive to that fact that Red Mage is a little bit further behind. I hear it from my friends who have done Savages on Red Mage and Ultimates on Red Mage all the time, that they still feel like, hey, Red Mage could use something. But especially in older Ultimates, like, let's be honest, Summoner kind of is best in slot for the caster role. It's like, hey, what Black Mage recommendations do you have for me in Ubu? Play Summoner. But yeah, I don't really see a way without starting to really risk the balance of the game, which would start to get back into like delete monk things, or like White Mage or Aster or whatever. We have so many examples in the past of jobs being left out. I don't see a way to really make that work. Who else remembers piercing debuff? Anyone? Piercing debuff with Dragoon? I think that that's what the developers really want to avoid.